The line used to sell Haze in 2008 was "Fight the addiction," which is funny as I was compelled to do anything but play it almost immediately after starting. Nevertheless, I'd penciled in an entire afternoon to get the job done, and so I grit my teeth and carried on. It was a strange experience. Upon beginning a new game, you're greeted by the sight of these clay-faced oddities and are forced to listen to them chat nonsense for a good 5 minutes.
Heads up, my boys. It's that time again. Sure is better than coffee and a slap in the face.
I am so ready to liberate some natives!
Hell yeah! Boosh!
Eventually, I was let off the leash to do some shooting, and the first thing I noticed was that the world sprawled out ahead of me didn't look much better than the unsightly soldiers I'd just been unfortunate enough to meet. I'll talk more about Haze's graphics later, but suffice to say, if you've ever played any of the quote-unquote gritty shooters of the mid to late noughties, its grey and brown, almost colourless aesthetic will be very familiar. Long story short, it all made for a terrible first impression, and as much as it pains me to say it, I think I somewhat hastily decided that Haze was an awful game after less than 10 minutes or so. Through sheer willpower, and driven by a desire to properly satiate my long-held curiosity regarding Haze though, I did manage to stumble over the finish line and reach its end credits. Now I've experienced Haze in all its glory, I feel I can safely say, I still reckon it's absolute toilet. It's a shame in a way, as following that diabolical opening, some intriguing elements did begin to present themselves. As Shane Carpenter, a soldier in the Mantel Corporation's private military, you have been sent to Boa in South America to help liberate the area from the vicious mercenary group The Promise Hand, led by the notorious Skincoat. Yes, you heard correctly, bloody Skincoat. Carpenter and the rest of Mantel's soldiers are all dosed to the gills with a drug named Nectar, which heightens many of their abilities. During gameplay, you can use it almost whenever you please to better see enemies, move faster, do more damage and the like, and you can make its effects last longer by killing more people, a clever addition which encourages you to embark on pharmaceutically fueled killing sprees. There are downsides though. What you might not realise at first is that Nectar also hides a lot of bad things from view, bad things you'll suddenly be privy to should your nectar supply dwindle. Scenes of carnage, dead bodies, blood splatter, which shows up in a very red on grey Schindler's List kind of way. You're suddenly able to see it all. If you find yourself at the other end of the spectrum having guzzled too much nectar, it's also possible to overdose. Your vision blurs, friends and foes manifest as shadowy figures, and you begin firing erratically at anyone you see, a bit like me when I play console shooters online. Unfortunately, because Carpenter decides to defect a third of the way through Haze's 4-hour campaign, after meeting Skincoat, also known as Gabriel Marino, Nectar use as a mechanic never evolves beyond its initial promise. Instead, it's taken away entirely. What a disappointment that is. Choosing between yamming as much combat meth as possible to make firefights easier, or abstaining and having a far more miserable experience in terms of both atmosphere and difficulty, is an idea which could have been built on. Midway through the campaign, you find out that Nectar eventually kills its users.
Who are these people?
Who? This is Sergeant Nick Cote. This is Lance Corporal Tom Rampton. And in one of those crates back there is my first drill instructor. These are all Mantle soldiers. And there's not a single bullet wound amongst them.
And that would have been the perfect point to turn things completely on their head to add consequence. Chronic Nectar users could suddenly begin to suffer the ramifications of their laissez-faire attitude to narcotics, with withdrawal symptoms making gameplay harder. By comparison, those who stayed relatively clean and struggled because of that choice could begin to reap the benefits of a drug-free approach by not suffering from any of those side effects. A big reason why that extra splash of imagination might be missing is because of Haze's troubled development. Since its release, several members of developer Free Radical Design have spoken of problems with publisher meddling, with Ubisoft allegedly over-managing amidst extremely tight deadlines. That was exacerbated by the PlayStation 3's unique complexities. It was not an easy machine to create games for. The game also picked up the moniker Halo Killer, which meant that despite a rocky development, expectations were sky high. It wasn't one chosen by the team, but rather touted by gaming media and encouraged by Ubisoft, although there were still other, more tangible reasons to be excited. Free Radical were responsible for the terrific Timesplitters series, and many team members also worked at Rare prior, playing a huge part in the success of GoldenEye. As we all know, when Haze released, many were bitterly disappointed, and excitement quickly turned to exasperation as more and more less than enthusiastic reviews began to surface. Circumstance may have played a huge part in Haze turning out the way it did and shaped people's reactions to it, but it must ultimately be judged based on what was delivered, and what was delivered is something of an omnishambles. Once the initial excitement of Nectar has dissipated, and especially once it's been pried from your shaking, drug-addled hands, you'll soon discover Haze hasn't got much else to offer. To limit the disappointment of you losing your synthetic superpowers after joining the rebels, a few new moves are introduced to supplement the tedium of gunplay, but most you'll likely only use once or twice before abandoning them. You can play dead when low on health and then rise again like an angry Lazarus, but if there was one feature I've personally never looked for in a shooter, it's the ability to lie down, and so I found it utterly pointless. You can also steal weapons, although you'll likely only try that once when the story mandates it. You can dodge, which I forgot existed until I proofread this script, and you can scavenge anti-nectar grenades which cause enemies to overdose and frenzy, or you can shoot their nectar administrator to achieve a similar effect. Sure, it's great they're all included, but most of them are predicated on having time and space to maneuver, which you usually don't. In a world where Halo 3 and Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare had already been out for nearly a year, describing the rest of Haze's gameplay as even passable is pretty generous. Considering its pre-release status of Halo Killer, it's laughable how far behind even 2001's Halo Combat Evolved it is. I originally planned to structure the rest of my gameplay comments like a compliment sandwich, as I know I've been quite negative. Start with a compliment, get stuck into the criticism, and finally end with another compliment. You know the drill. However, there's really only one major positive, so think of it more as a thin slice of compliment cheese on top of a very thick criticism cracker. The good thing is that you can customize your controls. I know this sounds like damning with faint praise, but 15 years ago it wasn't a standard option, and it made my time with Haze much more bearable. A little more bearable. Everything else is intensely mediocre. Both enemies and allies behave like they were dropped on the head as a baby, the AI not understanding anything happening around them. They'll run in front of you, stand next to live grenades without a care in the world, and get themselves run over. It happened to this poor fella, twice in very quick succession. They'll also repeat the same few voice lines over and over again until they're burned into your brain.
Remember your promise to Merino!
Since playing Haze, when I wake up in the morning, all I hear is,
Remember your promise to Merino!
while I'm eating lunch,
Remember your promise to Merino!
when I'm trying to sleep.
Remember your promise to Merino!
It's a level of obnoxious I never knew existed. On the topic of obnoxious, the pulsing red indicator denoting damage taken must surely be one of the worst in any shooter. It will happen if an enemy so much as blows a raspberry in your direction, which makes it incredibly difficult to judge how much trouble you're in, as you spend so much time apparently teetering on the edge of death. The weapons that cause that horrendous effect are exactly what you'd expect too, with a pistol, an assault rifle, a shotgun, a rocket launcher, and so on. Sometimes two of each with a different skin for Mantle and the Rebels, and enemy variety is equally uninspired, them basically all being the same bad guy but carrying a different one of those firearms. You may as well be throwing pillows at enemies for all the good grenades do 99% of the time as well. Level design alternates between being linear and uninspired, and way too large for the minimal spectacle occurring. That can become especially irritating quickly, as it's not always made clear what you need to do or where you need to go to complete an objective. When that means running through massive drab environments like this foundry, events can get real tiring real quick. Every now and then there will be long periods of downtime just because as well. Strolling through a swamp for 8 to 10 minutes while barely anything happens is the worst of the bunch, although walking slowly alongside this missile definitely gives it a run for its money. A comparison to Halo which can be rightfully made is that Haze also includes vehicles, although don't expect anything like the former's big open dynamic battles. You'll trundle down roads and around the occasional open area at about the same speed as a three-legged dog, but with less enthusiasm, due to turning at any considerable speed being impossible. Squad mates will hop in to join you but barely shoot and can't drive, rendering them useless, which means you'll be shot from all angles with little recourse until your vehicle explodes, which will happen with frightening regularity as I'm convinced they're made out of cardboard. There are a couple of on-rails sections featuring a minigun to break things up, which showed promise for precisely 3 seconds, until you realise it is shockingly inaccurate. This section storming a mantle land carrier near the game's conclusion about sums it up. Most of the time you'll barely be able to target any enemies, let alone hit them, and any spectacle the set piece provides is rendered pointless as you're constantly teleported to different sides of the carrier without any proper transitions. It is stunningly immersion breaking. There is also a final boss, Morgan Duval, the leader of the Mantle squad you left, and it's one of the most hilariously anticlimactic final encounters I've stumbled upon across 3 decades of gaming.
There's only 2 of us here now, so which one of us is normal?
Whichever one of us survives.
Fuck you.
You're insane!
You're the one who killed the people who rescued you from the car!
I thought about trying it a second time to see how the fight might develop if I didn't rush in and win immediately like a total first-person shooter pro, but I was more than ready to do anything else, and so I decided I didn't need to know. I've little to add to my brief comments earlier regarding Haze's graphics. They weren't the worst for 2008, but equally they're drab, unexciting, and feature nothing to set the game apart from its peers in any way, shape or form. Effects are where the most dubious visuals can be found, with many of them looking decidedly two-dimensional in nature and sticking out like a sore thumb. It can at times look like some of them were created by copying and pasting JPEGs into Haze's asset library. If you like glitches and other graphical oddities, you're going to be well catered for too. Haze's story suffers from the same issues as the concept of Nectar I spoke about earlier. There is the genesis of a few good ideas in there somewhere, but that thin layer of gold is surrounded by piles of festering offal. You're going to need to ignore a lot of dodgy dialogue before you'll find any enjoyment. The majority of it is straight up awful.
Let's get the fuck out of here! Looks like we need to drop off a prisoner and a pussy!
Here, puss! Pussy!
And the obsession the game has with pushing this meat analogy is bizarre, seeing as it's not particularly clever.
You're not a carnivore. You're meat. Just like them. Look at you. You're an ant under my magnifying glass. A pig under my carving knife. But a good piece of meat needs to be hung first. It needs to bleed out before it's ready to be eaten.
I get it, soldiers are being treated like cattle, thrown into the meat grinder of war to be chewed up and spat out. However, with dialogue lacking any gravitas, it all comes across as quite banal. But, as ham-fisted as all the dialogue may be, it is just one of the many ways Free Radical alludes to the idea of dehumanization, the damaging effects of propaganda, and the horrors of war and their effect on both soldiers and civilians. Fighting for Mantle, it's found in the way enemies light up when you're on Nectar, so they barely look like people at all, and dead bodies disappearing. After siding with the rebels, you see it in former allies sobering up and realising what they've done as their nectar supply runs dry.
I did something bad. I did something bad. Oh God, I did something bad. I threw her in the fire. I threw her in the fire. I did something bad.
Sir! Sir! Sir, you're hurt! Sir! 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 Sir!
I'm sorry.
You can see it in Duval too before he dies, asking Carpenter not to tell his mother what he's done.
Jane. Please. Don't tell my mom.
He is a truly horrible bloke and an irritating character through and through, but Free Radical giving him that final moment of humanity, of clarity, I found effective, and it shows what could have been achieved throughout. The rest of the story as a whole you'll have heard before. A soldier fights for what turns out to be the wrong side, switches allegiances after learning the truth, and helps the rebels eventually emerge victorious. Unfortunately for all the good bits, which you really have to dig for, so much of Haze is so poorly written that you're never more than a minute or two away from something bad or something generic. Strip the Nectar mechanic and many of the story's themes and transplant them into a more competent shooter, and I think they'd be talked about a lot more in the present. Oh, there are also a couple of lines in particular which were seemingly less the product of a rushed writing room and more the scrawlings of an elderly homophobe. I'm not going to play the clip's audio, but if you read the subtitles appearing on screen now, you'll understand. It's really bad form, even for 2008. I expected to find myself with strong opinions regarding Haze by the time I reached its end credits, but my overriding feeling was simply that I'd wasted a chunk of my life getting hands-on with an exercise in futility. Somewhere below the mountains of tripe, there are some interesting ideas, but they fail to stand out as much as they might have otherwise due to how wonky everything else is. Thankfully, the experience only took up a single afternoon. Haze is not a good game by any metric, however it's also not atrocious enough that I derived any joy from it either. I was hoping for so bad it's good. What I got was so mediocre it's soul-destroying. During the writing of this script and the creation of this video, I made peace with the fact I'll never get any of the time spent on Haze back, even if I do wish I could just pump myself full of nectar and forget about it altogether. I also want to leave you with one key takeaway, the part of Haze which most made an impression on me and has stuck with me since, and that is...
Remember your promise to Merino!
Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and nectar addicts. If it left you feeling amped up, do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts on Haze. And all's well, I'll see you again soon.